change of the weather, some people might have a little rock and roll pneumonia!
You wanted the best, you got the best. From my home studio on Long Island, New York, welcome to Ian Scotto Rocks. I am your host, Ian Scotto. In 1988, a band would emerge on the scene of LA looking something like and even sounding something almost like Bon Jovi. If only Bon Jovi were comprised of a completely female lineup. That band was VIXEN, of course. And though VIXEN had been formed over a decade prior in the much chillier region of St. Paul, Minnesota by guitarist Jan Kuehnemund and a completely different lineup, the band that would form in the scene of the Sunset Strip, like many other bands of the late 80s, is the one we all remember. Jan on guitars, of course, Janet Gardner on vocals, Cher Ross, then Cher Peterson on bass, and Roxy Petrucci on drums. On August 31st, 1988, their self-titled debut would come out on EMI Records, and its first single, Edge of a Broken Heart, would peak at number 25 on the Billboard Hot 100. The album would eventually go gold and prove to be a success. Despite this, members of the band did have some issues with their direction that they wanted to change. Not only had their first single been written by hired guns like Richard Marx, who was also a producer on the album, but the two follow-up singles, Cryin' and Love Made Me, were also written by outside songwriters. Only half of the album had co-writing credits by members of VIXEN, and it was almost as though the record label didn't trust the ladies to produce. This would change 2 short years later with the release of Rev It Up, and though some outside writers were utilized, with the exception of It Wouldn't Be Love penned by Diane Warren, every song in the album featured writing credits by the members of VIXEN. Interestingly, half of those songs had been written by the team of Cher and Janet, who had a knack for writing songs together. In later interviews about this time period, we would learn that the duo were insistent on VIXEN having more creative control, while the other two ladies were okay with continuing to work with outside writers, since it was outside writers who got them their first top 40 hit. VIXEN would shoot music videos for How Much Love, Love is a Killer, and Not a Minute Too Soon, which received moderate airplay on MTV and rock radio, though nothing quite lived up to the success of Edge of a Broken Heart. Despite this, the band continued achieving milestones in their career at that time, like appearing on shows such as Arsenio Hall, and even taking part in the massively successful MTV Unplugged. The Rev It Up tour would go on for nearly 2 years, hitting everywhere in the US as well as international dates. They'd headline clubs and even opened for other major acts, including Kiss, on 8 dates of the Hot in the Shade tour. Shortly after touring for Rev It Up, however, the band would implode. So what went wrong? We would learn that there was some tension within the band, especially among Cher and Janet on one side, and Roxy and Jan on the other. Cher and Janet wanted the band writing all of their own material, and as the music scene was evolving, wanted to get away from the heavy keyboards featured on both VIXEN releases, and become a more guitar-fueled full-on rock band. They spoke of even adding another guitarist to the mix. This is a bit confusing to myself, considering Janet played rhythm guitars on a lot of their work. So was VIXEN toying with the idea of adding a third guitarist? How would that work exactly? Anyway, Roxy and Jan made the point that you couldn't really argue with the success of Edge of a Broken Heart, and Jan was dead set against their idea of adding another guitarist to the mix in fears of being replaced from the band she'd started. In addition to this, the scene in LA was dying out, as we all know, and being replaced by bands out of Seattle like Nirvana, Pearl Jam, and Alice in Chains. The celebratory rock anthems of VIXEN were old news. By some point in either late 1991 or early 1992, the ladies would get dropped from EMI, have a meeting about their future, and all members would decide to go their separate ways. VIXEN were far from the only band facing this dilemma, as bands like Rat and White Lion had also broken up within this same year. Not much is known about what the ladies did during the following 5 years beyond a few shortly lived side projects. But it was in 1997 that Roxy Petrucci would hook up with a guitarist from Long Island, New York named Gina Style. They clicked. And that's when Roxy would call up Janet Gardner and insist that she had to be a part of what they were doing. Janet agreed to take a drive out there to jam with the duo. Janet would also quickly bond with Gina, and talk of a VIXEN reunion naturally started to happen from there. I believe the two other members were still living on the West Coast during that time around LA, which also created some issues with coming to the New York area to jam. But beyond that, they had various reasons for not taking part. Cher was now married and moved on from those days, and was working on other musical projects. Interestingly enough, and a little known fact, if you remember an MTV VJ around that time by the name of Jesse Camp, who actually put out an album as Jesse and the 8th Street Kids, Cher actually played and wrote on much of that album. As for Jan, she wanted no part in a band using the name VIXEN without her being the sole lead guitar player. She asked Janet and Roxy not to use the name, but they did it anyway. This new version of VIXEN would sign to CMC Records, a hard rock label that catered to 80s era rock fans with bands still making music at that time. CMC's lineup featured bands like Slaughter, Warrant, LA Guns, and now VIXEN. While recording for the new project, Janet would interestingly enough meet an engineer working on the album by the name of Andy Katz, and the two would eventually marry and have a son together. In May of 1998, VIXEN would release Tangerine. The recognizable fox head logo was nowhere to be seen on the cover, featuring a tangerine with a piercing in it. Interesting. Gone were the pop-driven keyboards and celebratory anthems of the previous releases, and so were any outside writers, with every song on the album being penned by the team of Gardner and Style. I guess you would call the album more grunge, but by that time, even grunge had run its course. If you look back on music during that period, the summer of 1998 would see releases like Follow the Leader from Korn and Devil Without a Cause from Kid Rock. What people were listening to was drastically different in those 6 years, and bands from the 80s were definitely confused on which direction to take. As someone who was into music during that time, I can tell you that unlike today, bands like VIXEN were looked at as has-beens, and music of that time was not celebrated for its nostalgia at that point. For people embracing what was big on rock radio at that time, nothing could be less cool, quite honestly, than a band like VIXEN. This obviously created a quandary for these bands. Do you embrace the small fan base you still have and cater to that audience, or do you try to reinvent yourself for the times? Most bands actually did try to reinvent their sound, and practically none of it was successful. Unlike the first two VIXEN albums, Tangerine would not chart on Billboard. It received little to no promotion, with no music videos or singles from the album being released. With that being said, it's a very well-produced album with good songwriting, but it was VIXEN doing something that didn't sound or even look like VIXEN. The Tangerine tour would play only around a dozen dates throughout the US in smaller bars. Roxy's sister and former bandmate in Madam X, Maxine, would be brought on to play bass for some of these shows. While creating this video you're watching, I was under the impression that no footage of these shows existed, until I noticed that Roxy actually had the footage you're watching now up on her official YouTube channel. So major kudos to Roxy for this. She has a lot of great footage up on her channel from the VIXEN archives. Anyways, it was at this time that Jan Kuehnemund would sue this lineup of VIXEN for copyright infringement, winning the full rights to the name as the sole owner, and this lineup of VIXEN would soon be phased out due to this. Though Tangerine has since been put on streaming and digital music platforms, physical copies of this album are long out of print, but you can often find these CDs being resold on sites like eBay if you're looking to add it to your collection. The band no longer performs any of the songs from this era of VIXEN. In 2001, VIXEN would be approached by Vince Neil to reunite and open for him on his headlining Voices of Metal tour alongside Stephen Pearcy of Rat and Slaughter. Janet Gardner, Roxy Petrucci, and Jan Kuehnemund were all a yes. Cher, however, still was not. In her place would be a bassist by the name of Pat Holloway. After just a few shows, the ladies would clash again. In what would be possibly her final interview ever back in 2012 with the Decibel Geek podcast, Jan would open up about this time, how she was working with her own manager that put the tour together for the band. He told the ladies that they would start the tour in a van, but that they were working on getting an RV to give them some more space. It never happened. In addition, dates of the tour were canceled, leaving the ladies less money than initially promised. Mind you, the members of VIXEN were now in their 30s and 40s, and likely had to put their lives on hold for this tour and not be compensated what they were initially told. Janet would leave first. What you're seeing on screen now is the only footage of this tour that exists, to my knowledge, from the Akron, Ohio Ribbon Music Festival. Another kudos to whoever originally captured and posted this footage of VIXEN history. Jan is on guitar, Roxy is on drums, but that woman on vocals is not Janet Gardner. That is Jenna Sans Agero. Pretty shortly after this show, Roxy would also leave and be replaced by Kat Kraft. In 2004, VH1 would launch a successful show called Bands Reunited, and VIXEN would be an obvious choice approach to be on it, and that's exactly what they did. The show centered around finding all members of a band's classic lineup and getting them to agree to reunite for one show. Roxy was an immediate yes to getting back together. The other ladies were a bit more apprehensive. Jan still felt betrayed by Janet and Roxy doing an album without her and then leaving her high and dry on their last tour. Cher was now working on a new musical project called Bubble alongside her husband as well as two former members of Faster Pussycat. She would express a lack of interest in playing songs from her past that she had no part in writing. As for Janet, she was at the time enrolled in the University of Bridgeport in Connecticut to become a dental hygienist, and was also a new mother. Reluctantly, though, they would all sign off and play their first gig with the original lineup in over 12 years. As a fan, something that kind of sucks, I have to say, when you watch this footage, is that interest in 80s nostalgia wasn't quite what it would become in later years by this time. This was before the casino circuit for 80s bands that would explode somewhere around 2010. As you can see, the ladies are playing live to a small room at SIR Studios in LA. Though it's a legendary spot, it's merely a 350-person capacity venue. I feel like if VIXEN reunited 5 or so years later, they could have easily filled a much larger club. Nevertheless, they rocked it. Interest in VIXEN reignited, but that was the only show the reunited lineup would ever do. Having full rights to the band name, Jan Kuehnemund would get back the last lineup she did shows with from 2001 after the other classic lineup of members left, and tour again throughout Europe and the US for several years. This lineup would record an album called Live and Learn in 2006, and in my opinion, it really sounds nothing at all like VIXEN, and just doesn't really do it for me. The album cover itself, as you can see, just looks kind of thrown together, and I just don't hear the same magic on this. You can say the same about Tangerine, but there's something just great about Janet Gardner's voice and even Roxy's drumming to me, along with the much more polished production on that album, that I can at least get into it. For several years, the other members of VIXEN outside of Jan and company would go on with their personal lives, careers, and pursue other passions. As mentioned earlier, though, around 2010 is when there was this growing interest in the 80s rock scene. Fans who grew up in that era were hungry to see some of their favorite bands reunite. Members of the old lineup of VIXEN would be tapped to play some major festivals again. The only problem, once again, was that Jan Kuehnemund was the sole owner of the name VIXEN, thanks to the lawsuit she'd won 14 years prior. Jan wanted no part in the band and preferred working with the new lineup of VIXEN that she had full control over. Eager to still play these shows they were asked to be a part of, the ladies brought back Gina Style on guitar and toyed with the idea of calling themselves VXN, but were cautious of yet another possible lawsuit from Jan. They would go on with the name Janet Cher Roxy Gina, or JSRG. Horrible name, might I add, but it is what it is. JSRG would play some major events in 2013, including the Monsters of Rock Cruise, Rocklahoma, M3 Fest, and Firefest X in England. The ladies looked and sounded amazing, but not being able to use the name VIXEN really creates some obstacles. It's hard to book JSRG for a tour and fill up venues without the general audience understanding who that is. While this was all going on, Jan Kuehnemund would be diagnosed with cancer. According to the other classic lineup members of VIXEN, Jan would finally express interest in wanting to reunite with that full lineup once she recovered, but unfortunately, that day would never come. On October 10th of 2013, Jan Kuehnemund would pass away. I do not know what agreements would be made following her tragic death between the surviving members of Jan Kuehnemund's VIXEN and the other 3 members of the classic lineup, but shortly following this news, access to Jan Kuehnemund's VIXEN lineup's social media pages would change hands. As you can see here, this post would be put up indicating that Janet, Cher, Roxy, and Gina would be carrying on together, and now officially under the name VIXEN. Would the legal rights to use the name be handed over to them behind the scenes from Jan's estate? I'm really not privy to that information, but there must have been some sort of a legal agreement in order to make this happen. From 2014 to 2017, the Janet, Cher, Roxy, and Gina lineup would play shows throughout the world and make it a point to honor Jan's legacy during their set. But then, yet another lineup change would occur. Roxy and Cher would meet Britt Lightning on the Monsters of Rock cruise and be floored by the talent of this younger up-and-coming guitarist. During this same time, they would have some tensions with longtime guitarist Gina Style and decided that maybe it was time for a change. Britt Lightning would join the fold, replacing Gina, and although she went along with it, Janet has stated in interviews that she did not agree with the move to change members and thought that Gina was a crucial part of the VIXEN lineup. Interestingly enough, early in her career, Britt would play a gig in Connecticut opening up for Jan's lineup of VIXEN. She even got this photo taken. Who would have guessed that she would one day take over where Jan left off in the band? Also at this time, longtime live keyboardist Chris Faze would be replaced by Tyson Leslie, who remains a beloved current member of the band by fans. In 2018, this lineup of VIXEN would release a live album recorded at the Arcada Theater in Chicago. They sounded tight and energetic. This was a show where they were opening up for Slaughter. Janet's stage banter before they end with Edge of a Broken Heart seriously cracks me up, though.
I had a Portillo's chopped salad today. Made my day. Made my day.
The first time I listened to the VIXEN live album, which is actually just sitting here right in front of me, great album. I was just like, that's like the least rock and roll thing I've ever heard, but yet I love it and it works for them. So it's not me poking fun or anything, but I mean, but right before they play Edge of a Broken Heart. This is like the climax of the show, you know? Like, could you ever picture Paul Stanley doing this? I need some energy before the show, people. I need my chopped salad. It's hotter than hell. Like, I just couldn't picture it, and it does make me laugh when I hear her talk about her love of chopped salads there before going into Edge of a Broken Heart. Anyway. During this time, Janet, since divorced from Andy Katz, would meet a musician by the name of Justin James. The two would hit it off both musically and romantically, and soon move in together in Chicago and work on outside musical projects. They would get married and release several albums together. Her life would take an unexpected turn, though, when she would have to undergo a life-saving brain surgery. With events for VIXEN still scheduled, however, Roxy would recruit femme fatale frontwoman Lorraine Lewis to cover on vocals for this series of live shows. The connection was there, with Lorraine being the singer in a short-lived side project with Roxy during the mid-2000s called Rocktopus, and the two still being in touch. After a successful surgery, Janet Gardner began to rethink her future with VIXEN. Beyond just a few songs, VIXEN had not recorded new music in decades, and Janet was enjoying putting out new work with her husband. Now practicing as a dental hygienist for a number of years as well, the touring schedule for VIXEN was beginning to be too much to balance for Janet. She'd decide to leave for good, and Lorraine Lewis would soon after become a permanent member of the band. The Cher, Roxy, Britt, and Lorraine lineup would last up until 2022, when yet another change would rock VIXEN. On February 8th in Miami, Cher Ross would play her final show with VIXEN, and the set would end with Cher ceremoniously handing over her bass to new member Julia Lage, originally from Brazil, for the encore of Edge of a Broken Heart as they welcomed her into the band. Following her departure, Cher would go full-time as a real estate agent in sunny South Florida and express in interviews that although she cherishes her time in VIXEN, she would make it clear that the money she made throughout those years was certainly not something you could live a rock star lifestyle off of. She would continue to express that she wished the band had written more material so that they could make publishing money from that. But this is certainly debatable. If the band did all originals, as Cher seems to wish they had, would they ever have scored a hit to the level of Edge of a Broken Heart? I'm not so sure they would have. And that song is what really has been able to keep the band touring as a legacy act as long as they have. There are plenty of bands from VIXEN's era that got signed, had a following for years, but are now long forgotten because they never had that one hit that connected with a mainstream audience. On January 20th of 2024, VIXEN would play to Mohegan Sun Arena on a bill that included Stephen Pearcy, Quiet Riot, and the last ever show of Riley's LA Guns following the death of Steve Riley as they honored his legacy. I was at this show, and little did I or anyone else know that this would be the last ever show for VIXEN with Lorraine Lewis. What were my thoughts? I had a good time seeing them, but as someone who's seen Janet Gardner live, and this being my first time seeing this version of VIXEN, I can honestly say that Janet has a presence and gives a live vocal performance that is very hard to replace. That's no disrespect to Lorraine, who filled that role during a pivotal time to keep the band going, but I don't know if I'd say she was quite the right fit. I got a chance to meet Lorraine since that show, and she's absolutely awesome, quite honestly, and still does justice when performing her Femme Fatale catalog live. VIXEN is just a very different band to me. I've talked to Lorraine since and would love to have her on the channel. I've just been putting it off to when I can see her in person again, because I really prefer doing interviews in person as opposed to the Zoom stuff that's oversaturated YouTube since 2020. It'd be awesome to discuss her revamped version of Femme Fatale, her work casting reality TV shows, and yes, even her OnlyFans page. And if you don't already know, Lorraine Lewis does indeed have an OnlyFans page, if you ever wanted to see the sexy Femme Fatale frontwoman in the buff. Interestingly enough, just a few months after that VIXEN show I went to, I would attend Motley Crue at Bowery Ballroom, and hanging out there as fans, I saw Britt Lightning with her boyfriend Tommy London of SiriusXM. I introduced myself, and Britt would agree to come on my podcast at the time with Chris Peranto. It made for a riveting timeline to talk to her, coincidentally, since we ended up scheduling this right after VIXEN had announced that a new singer would be coming into the fold. Our interview would actually make some headlines when Britt would admit that she had not even met the yet-to-be-announced vocalist, but that she trusted Roxy's judgment in recruiting someone who would be the right fit. On June 21st of 2024, VIXEN would play Anaheim, California with Quiet Riot, Great White, and Slaughter, but all eyes were on who the new singer would be for VIXEN opening up the show. The crowd would learn that this fresh face was Rosa Larashuta, a Canadian-born vocalist best known for performing as a member of Trans-Siberian Orchestra. By all accounts, she knocked it out of the park. Following this show, I would get to see them play Mohegan again, this time at the smaller Wolf Den, and I can absolutely say that Rosa Larashuta is an excellent fit for the band. This current lineup as a whole has an energy live that is unmatched. So there you have it. That's where VIXEN is now. And as crazy as it may sound, even after this really in-depth deep dive, I feel we've barely scratched the surface. VIXEN has had a total of nearly 30 members and live performers from its inception in Minnesota to now, and we've really only discussed a fraction of those. Believe it or not, Ace Von Johnson even once played with VIXEN, as strange as that sounds. Had I have known about this, I probably would have asked him about that on our interview a couple of months back. We've even lost a few of the members tragically beyond Jan. Raina Ross, who played some shows on bass during the Tangerine years, would die in 2003. Cindy Betcher, who was on keys prior to the first album, would die in 2014. And Nancy Sharks of the original lineup from their time in Minnesota would pass in 2019. It's safe to say there can easily be a really great documentary made about the VIXEN story if any director ever wanted to take up that project. Heck, if the right offer is out there to do something like that, I'll do it. Hey, Netflix, give me a call. Let's do the VIXEN documentary. Some of you may be asking, with only one member left, is it still VIXEN? That's really up for you guys to decide. If it's a tribute band, it's a damn good tribute band, and I can promise you that. At the end of the day, there's only so many more years left for these bands and artists to tour. Whether it's Janet Gardner performing live with her husband or the current lineup of VIXEN, that's who's keeping the legacy alive. And I definitely believe the VIXEN catalog should continue to be celebrated. Well, I really hope you guys enjoyed that VIXEN deep dive. If you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe and like the video, hype the video. Any support of us really helps as an up-and-coming YouTube channel, so check out the merch store. It's always appreciated if you send us a super thanks because a lot of work went into making this. Now, two things before we get out of here. I wanted to say, if you're thinking of seeing VIXEN live, go see them. I'm going to see them again in the next few days, also at Mohegan Sun. They put on a killer live show, and the cool thing, too, is they do a lot on the casino circuit. A lot of those shows are free or very low priced. So, I get comments all the time about how costly shows have gotten. They try to get you in the casinos so that you could spend some money on the great restaurants and gambling and all that, but you don't have to. Just go see the band, support, maybe buy a t-shirt and check them out because they're freaking awesome. If you're someone who's like a casual fan who came across this video, I really insist to you guys, the Rev It Up album is one of the greatest albums of the hair metal genre. Like, I would put it way up there, probably in the top 20 of the era. From start to finish, just about every song in there is killer. So I'm not saying listen to everything VIXEN has ever put out. I mean, if you want to, but you gotta at least listen to that Rev It Up album start to finish because it's something I replay all the time. Hope you enjoyed this video. We're going to do more deep dives in the future. Leave your comments of what you want to see, any of that stuff, or just any comments about VIXEN, any memories of seeing VIXEN live. I wonder if anyone seeing this saw those Tangerine shows, because that was like a low point for the band, and now they're doing bigger and bigger shows, sometimes even arenas when they're opening up for other 80s acts like Stephen Pearcy and Great White and all of those great bands that we listed. With that, I did a video a while back on the best replacement singers out there, and I, of course, included Rosa Larasciuta. If you want to hear some of her amazing live performance, it'll probably convince you to go see VIXEN sometime. You can check that out right here.